Hi class, this is Dr. McGonigal with another lecture for your Research Methods 2 class. Today we're going to cover topics in research ethics, including historical background, the Belmont Report, APA guidelines for ethical research, and Institutional Review Board guidelines. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment that happened between 1932 and 1972 is an example of research ethics gone wrong. And as part of your assignments for this week, you have to watch these two videos that are linked here. Now these are also linked right from the Canvas page. I'm not going to play them during this video, but please make sure that you watch them. The Milgram experiment was also an experiment that lacked research ethics, and this was in 1963. Again, the link is right from the Canvas page and also available here. They are the same links. So concerns that stemmed from the Tuskegee experiment and the Milgram study, which will become apparent to you once you watch these videos, they led to the development of the Belmont Report, which was published in 1978. So the Belmont Report provided guidelines for ethical research. The full report is available in the link below, and you can also find this linked directly from the Canvas page as well. Please go ahead and read the Belmont Report for your readings this week. The Belmont Report, first of all, distinguishes between research and practice. So it basically says that research is for understanding things, whereas practice is about implementing the best possible practices for people. And that's important to distinguish, because if you are a research participant and you have severe depression, you need to know if what you're signing up for is a research study for something that has not been proven versus the best practice that we know is available based on the research that exists. The Belmont Report contains three basic ethical principles. The first is beneficence, the second is respect for persons, and the third is justice, and I'll go through each of these in turn in just a moment. It also includes applications of each of these three in terms of assessment of risks and benefits of the research, informed consent and autonomy for participants, and selection of research subjects. We'll start with beneficence, and this has to do with risks and benefits of the research study. So the idea is that researchers need to maximize the benefits of their studies and minimize the risks to participants. So with every study comes this risk-benefit analysis. And once you have watched the videos of the Tuskegee experiments and the Milgram study, you can ask yourself, was the benefit worth the risks that were posed to participants of those studies? And I think that the answer in both cases would be no. So this acknowledges that there are potential risks of psychological research. In some cases, these could include physical harm. So for example, as a result of drugs taken in a study, if you agreed to participate in a research study of a pharmacological drug, there are potential risks involved with that could harm you physically. In terms of other potential risks of psychological research, you can also have psychological harm, and these are more common in psychological research. For example, this could include stress due to being asked about traumatic events in a survey. So if you're taking a survey about a traumatic event, perhaps you haven't thought about that event in a while, and by thinking about it while you're taking the survey, that could trigger some trauma reactions in you. Another is loss of privacy and confidentiality. So when we're talking about the words privacy, anonymity, confidentiality, they're all referring to slightly different things. So let me explain what each of them does mean. Privacy is referring to the need for researchers to not be asking questions that are obtrusive, especially if they're not related to the research question at hand. So for instance, researchers don't always need to know about, for instance, your sexual orientation, maybe even your gender, depending on the research question. So if the research doesn't require knowing that information, then the researcher is better off leaving it out of the survey because of the possibility of someone finding that information and the participant losing privacy around that. Now, confidentiality is when a researcher asks questions of a researcher or has information on a participant, and they need to keep that information secure and confidential so that the participant's name or other identifying information is not attached to their data, their personal data. So that's what confidentiality means. Anonymity is slightly different. So anonymity means that a researcher would not collect any identifying information of the participant. So if I would conduct an anonymous survey and I did not ask for the participant's name, I did not ask for their email address, and I did not collect any IP addresses as part of the survey, then I could say that my survey is reasonably anonymous. Also important to know is that it's really important to keep your data secure, and this has to do with confidentiality. So if you do have confidential information from participants, making sure that you're keeping that data safe. Okay, so that wraps up beneficence in terms of risks and benefits. Let's talk about respect for persons, and this has to do with autonomy and informed consent. So the idea behind this is that participants should be treated as autonomous. So what does that mean? It means that they're independent individuals that are capable of making a decision about whether or not they want to participate, and that they're not coerced into participating in any way, that it is completely voluntary. In terms of informed consent, it's the responsibility of researchers to provide prospective participants with information that can help them decide whether or not they want to participate in the study voluntarily. An informed consent form or information sheet is used in all research studies, and this contains information that participants can use to make an informed decision about whether or not they want to participate. It also states that participation is voluntary on the part of the participant. These informed consent forms or information sheets are often including study purpose, the procedures involved, the risks and benefits, the compensation or inducements, confidentiality. They assure voluntary participation, and they provide the researcher's contact information in case the participant has questions or concerns. There can be autonomy issues with research in terms of minors and adults with cognitive impairments, so researchers need to be aware of these and make sure that they're not unduly coercing people into participating. So for instance, if I were to conduct a research study with UNCC students and I offered, say, a $500 incentive to participate in my study, that might be seen as coercion because students are oftentimes working in low-wage jobs and need extra money, and a student might see that and say, hey, I can't pass this up, I have to participate in this. So that would not be allowable in terms of research ethics. In terms of information issues, withholding information may be necessary in some studies. We call this deception, and it may involve also the use of what we call confederates in an experimental study. When deception is required, researchers are also required to do what we call a debriefing, which is to tell participants about the true nature of the study. After it's over, I should say. Okay, so the third principle is justice, and this has to do with selection of research participants. The idea is that there should be fairness in receiving the benefits and bearing the burdens associated with research, so that we're not researching only white males, for instance, that we are also researching people of color, we're also researching different racial and ethnic backgrounds, all different types of individuals, so that we can have those individuals benefit from the results of that research. So any decisions to include or exclude certain groups of people from a study must be justified on scientific grounds. One example that I can think of is that if a study is being done on pregnant people, then maybe the study would be limited to females. Okay, so let's talk about some ethical rules for researchers as specified by the APA Ethics Code. This came in 2002, much after the 1978 Belmont Report, and it has been revised a few times since then. You can find the full list of the Ethics Code at the website that's listed at the top of the slide. So the first is that institutional approval is required for research. And so all researchers, including myself, have to go through an approval process every time we want to conduct a research study. We fill out paperwork and we provide all of the forms and everything related to our research study to the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. We also need to provide informed consent, not only to the research study overall, which I already talked about, but also in terms of using any possible voice recordings of participants and images from participants. Special attention has to be paid when research participants are subordinate in some way to the researcher. So, for instance, if research is being done on patients of a particular doctor or clients of a particular consultant, students of a teacher, then they might be seen as being coerced into participating. Because, for instance, if your teacher is asking you to participate in a research study, you might feel like, oh, I really have to do this if I want to get a good grade in the class. So that would be seen as coercion. There are special things to keep in mind when you're offering incentives for research, like I just mentioned earlier, that you're not offering too high of an incentive, that you're coercing people. I talked earlier about deception and debriefing, humane use and care for animals in research when animals are involved, and finally, reporting research results has its own set of guidelines. So first of all, no fabricating data. That means you cannot make up data. No plagiarism. That might sound familiar because we have that guideline in this class as well. Appropriate publication credit. That means that the authors who are listed on the publication have contributed to that publication, and the order of the authors is in line with the order of the contribution. So the person who made the biggest contribution goes first, and so forth. No duplicate publication of data. That means if I conduct a study and I publish a paper on it, then I can't go and publish that paper or that study again in another paper. It has to be a different study. You can use the data again, but you can't pass it off as a new study if it's the same study. You must share data for research review. So during the peer review process, lots of journals will ask researchers to submit de-identified data or anonymous data. So you can take people's names out of it, participants' names out of it, and pass it on to the review team so they can check your statistics and make sure that you've done everything correctly. And the last is the confidentiality of the review process. So as peer reviewers, we as researchers review other people's work as well. And we need to keep their work and the fact that we reviewed it confidential. Let's talk a little bit more about the Institutional Review Board. This is abbreviated IRB. This covers all research involving human subjects done at the institution or for the institution elsewhere or by a member of the institution. So UNCC has an Institutional Review Board, as do most colleges and universities and medical schools and hospitals and research centers. There are different categories of review: full review, expedited review, and exempt from continuing review. Full review is for studies that pose the most risk, and they involve at least 5 voting members on the Institutional Review Board who have different backgrounds and review the study. Researchers must submit an application, all their materials like manipulations, surveys, advertisements, basically anything that could be seen or heard by the participant or the subject or potential participants that they're recruiting. Researchers must submit to the IRB every year, and anytime they make a change to their study, they have to ask for making modifications to that study. In terms of IRB approval, the criteria are that risks to subjects are minimized and are reasonable in relation to the benefits. That selection of subjects is equitable, that informed consent will be sought when appropriate and will be documented and maintained. As appropriate, confidentiality of subjects will be maintained, and any vulnerable populations are safeguarded. So, do you need an IRB approval for your class project this semester? The answer is no, and the reason for that is your paper number 1, you're not going to be collecting any data, you're just writing your introduction section. And for your paper number 2, you don't need IRB approval because I am giving you data that I collected for a previous project that has been de-identified, so there's no identifying information in there, and you're simply using that data for the class project. So neither one of those qualifies as a research project that needs to be reviewed by the IRB.